Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Two Philosophers, One Conversation, where we remind ourselves that philosophy has always been done for the public good, and that right now we're all in one conversation that all of us are participants in. And today I'm really excited to have a friend of mine, an amazing scholar and activist, Kevin Timpe, with us. Kevin is a professor at Calvin College up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He also is the author of numerous books. The one perhaps most relevant today is Disability and Inclusive Communities, a recent edition that he published, which comes out of a lot of the work he's been doing recently on disability advocacy as it relates to his own familial situation, but also as it relates to his work as a philosopher of religion. So, Kevin, we're excited to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for doing these conversations. I think they're important in general, but especially important these days.
It's true. We find ourselves in a world that has undergone a seismic change. And yet, despite the fact that everything around us seems to be cracking in really problematic ways, it also kind of reminds us that some bedrock doesn't ever crack. And those bedrocks are human meaning matters. We're still mortal. And ultimately, as C.S. Lewis says, nothing essential gets changed when bombs drop. It's just that we get reminded of what was always the case. So thanks for being with us. Maybe we can start off today. Just tell us a little bit about your own relationship to disability advocacy. How did you get involved in this? Your early work was about free will and philosophy of religion. And then suddenly there seems to be this shift in at least your public face of philosophy work.
Yeah.
But how has that come about in your own?
It's unfortunate, I think, but as often happens, the shift from ignoring disability to having to think about disability came when it affected our family directly. Again, I think that this is often what happens. I think it's unfortunate. It would have been good had I been thinking about these sorts of things for a long time. But for those of us that aren't disabled and don't have disability that directly affects our day-to-day lives, we can often pretend as if it's not out there. So for us, it hit about 11 or 12 years ago when our first child was born. We realized when he was really young that he has two chromosomal abnormalities, one of which at the time hadn't been diagnosed before. Now there's about 60 diagnosed cases worldwide. And this is the one that causes, to the best of our knowledge, his disabilities. It causes gross and fine motor control issues, some emotional regulation issues. He's got an autism diagnosis, which is pretty common with the underlying condition. And so for the first few years of his life, it was just trying to figure out, A, how to parent in general, B, how to parent under really uncertain circumstances, which these days is, a lesson lots of us are thinking about. And then when he went to public school back in Idaho, where we used to live, we realized after about a year that the school had been systematically violating state and federal law with respect to his education. And of course, given that this was sort of their pattern of doing stuff, state and federal law with respect to disability education for most of his classmates. And so we started doing initially just advocacy work for him, then advocacy work for other students. This was at the same time I was coming up on my first sabbatical, so I decided to start thinking about disability philosophically as well. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, I started shifting to writing less and less on free will, though I still do some of that, and shifting more and more over time to writing about philosophy of disability sorts of issues. And so for the last 5 years, I've been doing a fair bit of that. Have also been continuing disability advocacy in our local community, originally back in Idaho, now here in Michigan, to try to help families get the kinds of resources that they need and often that are provided for by state and federal law if you know how to push.
Yeah. What has been the general response from maybe to say two different outlets? One, what's been the response from your universities, you shifting into these areas? I could see in some cases, you're hired to do philosophy of religion and suddenly you're doing this very different thing. Has there been support and encouragement? And on the other hand, how have local businesses and the education system and local leaders responded? Because my hunch is this is the kind of work, ironically, that philosophers have always been doing. we disrupt what everyone else takes for granted. And in doing this, the status quo suddenly is no longer in accordance with what truth, virtue, and excellence would demand. Of course, it got Socrates killed. So how has this worked out for you?
So yeah, one of these is a lot easier to answer because it's a lot more uniform, and that's the first part. I started this shift before I came to Calvin. I was in the middle of making this shift when I interviewed for the position I currently have. My department has been spectacularly supportive. During the interview process, it was clear that the kind of public facing work, the kind of work for what it means to be a philosopher, what it means to be a Christian philosopher and engage the world was the kind of thing that they wanted me to do. The university as a whole has been really, really supportive of that. I've started to work philosophy of disability into my intro class. I've done a couple of disability studies type courses for first year students. And I was actually asked by our Dean of Inclusion to do a one credit class this semester on disability culture. All Calvin students have to take a cultural competency course that sort of exposes them to a non-dominant culture. And so our university thinks of disability as a cultural and a structural issue. So that's been fantastic. The other part of your question is a lot more mixed. Families that I've worked with are very, very supportive of the sorts of things that I'm doing. Professional training in philosophy prepares you to read complicated texts like state laws and state policy manuals, to make arguments both in writing and in person. And so the kinds of skills that philosophy has fostered have been really good for my advocacy work. Schools don't always appreciate me. Sometimes the people in the schools appreciate me. So there's been a number of therapists that provide supports in schools or even teachers that have told me sort of off the record, we're so glad for what you're doing. We need it because the system is structured such that we can't make this kind of advocacy ourselves. But we see that it's needed. We got into this because we cared about students, we cared about children, and the ways in which the power dynamics work, the ways in which schools or states that have weak teacher unions function. And all of this has made certain kinds of stuff difficult for the therapists and the teachers to do themselves. And so sometimes they will be really, really appreciative of the kinds of work that I'm doing. It makes their lives hard, of course, but school administrators often don't appreciate me. I was in a local school district here about a year ago. The first meeting in that school district, they said something which entailed that they had violated state and federal law. I pointed out, we're not going to continue until you write that down in the minutes for the meeting. And so in every meeting that I've been at in that school district since then, legal counsel for the district has been present. And it's pretty clear that the legal counsel, even though sometimes that person has been helpful for particular issues with respect to the students in question, it's clear that the legal counsel is there to protect the district. And they told me in one meeting, they're like, Kevin, they said, Kevin, I don't appreciate you. And I just laughed. I'm not here to be appreciated. I'm here to help the student get and the family get the best sort of educational opportunities that you're required to give them. I've had some local businesses that have responded very well. Oh, thank you for pointing this out. We didn't realize that the contractor we'd used to make our parking lot didn't follow the ADA. Let's get that fixed. And then there have been some local businesses that have tried to get me fired by sending not very nice letters to my university president. So nobody's given me hemlock yet, though. So, I'm doing okay.
One of the weird things about where we find ourselves is that we're increasingly isolated, increasingly detached from other human interaction, and hopefully this is what's going to allow us to move forward without great cost of life. And yet, one of the things that I find really fascinating is the social ties that are beginning to emerge in virtual ways. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that philosophers are particularly adept at thinking well about human interaction, despite the fact that we may not be very good at those interactions. And so given that this is something we should be able to think about well, how is it that you have seen this sort of disability advocacy, these pushbacks from local authorities, from the government? How has this helped you think differently about what it looks like to be in community.
Yeah.
How does our idea of living together maybe get infused with a different sense of virtue and connectivity by getting that kind of pushback and then finding ways to go forward with those people who need to be allies, right?
Hmm.
And how have you navigated that particular nexus?
Yeah. At least in two ways that come to mind right now. The first is I've learned a lot about sort of the human condition from working with disabled individuals, with a number of autistic friends of mine, where I've learned a lot of things. The early advent of the internet and discussion boards, for instance, were radical game changers for autistic individuals that otherwise felt isolated. Autism affects your social interaction in all sorts of ways. And so, autistic individuals have often been interpersonally isolated and disadvantaged when communicating with people sort of in meet space, real time, face to face interactions because of differences in body language, differences in communicative norms, and various kinds of things. And so actually the advent of early discussion boards, bulletin boards, those kinds of things were a real boon to the autistic community because it enabled them to connect with and form their own kinds of communities in ways that were in other ways sort of denied them in more traditional spaces, right? Even though the prevalence of autism is a lot higher than we often think, it's easier for autistic individuals to connect with other autistic individuals if you've got technology than if it requires interpersonal. And so how we think about what it means to be a community is actually often radically different than we normally take it to be for some folks, because those of us that are neurotypical, that aren't disabled, expect all human interactions to be a certain way, namely the way that we're used to. And so part of this work has helped me see that the ways in which we interact, the ways in which we are community often take a lot for granted and have very narrow constraints about what that does and ought to look like that maybe we could broaden out. And so that's one way. The other way is, as I've been doing more and more sort of specific philosophical writing on disability, I'm currently working on a series of papers that this summer is supposed to sort of morph into a book. Whether or not that happens, given the present situation, is up in the air. But what I'm looking at is the ways in which different disabilities affect human agency. I think that disability is probably a lot more complicated than we often think that it is. I don't even think that we can give necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for what it means to be disabled or to have a disability. But I'm looking at different kinds of disabilities and how they affect human agency, in part because I think it teaches us something about what it means to be human in general. We can learn something about the human condition from looking at these sorts of what we might think of as marginal cases. This is a phrase from David Shoemaker, a philosopher down at, I believe he's at Tulane. He's got a book called Responsibility from the Margins. And so I think that his approach is really, really useful. We can learn something about what it means to be human from looking at these sort of unusual cases. And so part of what the book project is to do is to argue that by looking at disability and how it affects human agency in general, we can learn something about what it means to be human. I draw a lot on the work of Alistair McIntyre, who is sort of pushing back against this sort of rugged, super individualistic, hyper autonomous view of human nature that so many of us have assumed. I think that is both false and fundamentally unchristian, actually. And so you find out that the disabled individuals often have to rely on their community in more explicit ways than non-disabled individuals do, right? If you've got a physical disability that prevents you from being able to dress yourself, you're dependent on your community in a way that it's easy for lots of us to sort of ignore. And part of the current pandemic is actually making us rethink what it means to be community in certain kinds of ways, where the ways that we're used to being a community are called into question. The rugged individualism of us, if I just work hard enough, I'll be good, is being called into question. And so I actually think that a lot of the work on disability that I've been doing and a lot of the work on disability that I've been learning from shows us something really, really important about what it means to be human, whether or not we have a disability.
That's really fascinating. Maybe you could say a little bit more about in these specific times we find ourselves in now. The pandemic is changing our modes of behavior, our daily activities. I know I've got a 10-year-old son that my wife and I are trying to figure out how to homeschool. We're blessed that my wife used to be a second grade teacher. I mean, so we've got resources that we're drawing on that have really been helpful. And yet every day when we struggle, or yesterday he and I were trying to work out in the garden for a little while, and it just, the proximity was a little bit too much. I was like, man, I kind of need him to be with a teacher somewhere
Yeah,
else for a few hours a day in order for our time together to be the appropriate dad son kind of engagement, not also teacher, also
yeah,
disciplinarian, also principal, also friend because he doesn't have access to his friends every day. Like
yeah,
all of these things are getting just wrapped up into this bizarre ball that I think creates anxiety and tension and frustration. And then it boils over, of course, in
yeah,
ways that then we ask repentance for of each other and God
yeah,
and everybody. But when all this is going on, I also find myself repeatedly thinking about situations like yours, like other friends of mine, who not only are having to figure out all these transitions, but doing it in ways that then require special accommodations for learning styles, for different backgrounds, for techniques, different time intensive types
yeah.
of engagement. How do you speak maybe resources and hope to people like you who are struggling with this around the country right now?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, again, this is something that we all face, right? This idea that we're all radically dependent is shown to us by the fact that individually our health is no longer just a function of the precautions that we take, but a function of the precautions that the people, the few people that we do interact at the grocery store or something like that take. And so, again, this is a sort of a lesson that the disability community has been thinking about for a long time, right? Whether or not we can access certain kinds of healthcare right now depends upon how that is offered. But of course, how people access healthcare for a long time has been disproportionately disadvantaged to people. And so the current pandemic is going to affect disabled individuals in general in a different way, right? And again, this is going to be painting with a broad brush. What I'm going to say here doesn't apply to all disabilities equally. It's not perhaps unique to disability, right? But there are correlations that we have to take seriously. Many people with disabilities just have higher medical needs for some sorts of things than for others, and right, that's called into question right now. Our son gets weekly therapy that is currently prohibited, and so right, people that need PT or OT or speech services through outpatient kinds of means, right, are now at an additional disadvantage socially than are people that don't require those sorts of things. And we see something, similar with respect to school. We are currently trying to homeschool all three of our kids, in addition to holding down an online job now. Right? And that's just tricky in general. But it's extra tricky for those families that either have disabled parents trying to do all these sorts of things, or parents of disabled children, right, where they're trying to do all those sorts of things. Our son gets additional resources at school, which, right, he needs in order to access his educational environment. We're not able to provide those in the way that we used to. And so in addition to learning to become first grade teachers, fourth grade teachers, sixth grade teachers, we're also now having to learn how to be right, instructional aides, even when we're not being teachers. So the kinds of opportunities, kinds of supports that different children need, just right, are not the same across all cases. And as we have had to take on more and more of those responsibilities as parents because of quarantine concerns, not all families are having the same sorts of responsibilities added to their plates. Changes to routine for autistic kids is particularly difficult for many of them, right? And so even though it is not the last week where we've been self-quarantining hasn't been easy for any of our kids. For our child that has autism and for whom day-to-day structure and regularity is especially important, right? He's been especially discombobulated in these times. And then if I can, I know this is getting to be a long-winded answer, but maybe we can follow up on some of this. In the last week or so, as more and more schools have been moving to online instruction, one of the ways that this has been difficult is whether or not the online instruction that our kids are receiving these days actually counts as public education. So if the kind of education that our schools are trying to provide right now online counts as actual school time, actual instructional time, then they are governed by a law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the law that governs at the federal level what education for students with disabilities looks like. And so there's concern about whether or not online school is going to satisfy that as we move to more and more online education. Kentucky's largest district is specifically not thinking about what they are doing as actual instructional time, because if they do, then they have to follow what the idea would require of them for special education services, and they don't know how to do that right now. And so you've got this concern about the inability to provide public education for disabled students is now affecting how we are thinking about education online for all of our students. If a school is not providing education for disabled students in the same way that it is for all their students, then technically all their federal education dollars for the district are at risk. And so they don't want that to be a risk. I haven't followed up with this story. This is from a couple days ago. But one of the Senate Republicans' proposals for the COVID-19 stimulus package would actually potentially suspend the federal protections for disabled education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so, right, there's I mean, getting those sorts of proposals and laws passed back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was no small task. And now there's a real concern among parts of the disability community, the ways in which those kinds of legal protections might be rolled back in the response. After a lot of national disasters, right, the ways in which people with disabilities are systematically disadvantaged, right, whether it be from evacuating from a flood or from a hurricane, the ways in which people that require non-emergency medical procedures or care didn't get prioritized, and then understandably for people that do have emergency things. There are people that are, if they're not able to get the kind of medical care that they usually get, are going to be forcibly institutionalized in the nursing homes to provide this. And there's a long history of forcible institution of disabled individuals in this country that's really, really problematic. And so there's just lots of ways in which the current situation that we're experiencing, we need to think carefully about the ways in which it is not going to be uniform. And those of us that either have disabilities or care for people with disabilities or have children with disabilities are often going to be shouldering an even greater percentage of that burden than they would have been otherwise.
So what then might be some resources, some ideas that you might have for parents that have children with disabilities in particular, in light of these educational questions that we're certainly facing? What are ways that they can move forward, get the resources that they need, find the support that they need? Are there particular places for them to go? Are there particular recommendations that you would have? How do they become the kind of advocates for their own children that you are trying to be for all members of our community that have these disabilities?
Yeah. Partly, I don't know how to answer that question just because the exact legal situation of some of this is just so uncertain given the rate at which it's unfolding. I don't know how to right now advocate for students on IEPs, individualized educational plans, because it's not clear whether or not schools are actually legally required to provide any services right now, right? So I think that most parents of disabled children are used to having to be advocates. They're used to having to shoulder a lot of that burden. And so this is probably another case where they're feeling that extra hard. In general, good instruction for students with disabilities is good instruction. Uh, and so there are lots and lots of ways in which at least my social media community is sort of rallying around sharing lesson plans, sharing activities, sharing various kinds of things. And I think that parents of disabled students can be doing those sorts of things now. They might need to be doing them even more so than other families. The second thing is that parents of disabled students also are going to have to give themselves a little bit more grace, a little bit more understanding. And I recognize anybody that knows me is right now thinking, oh, isn't that the pot calling the kettle black, as the phrase goes? This is right. This is much, much easier to say than to do. It's not clear that we can, as parents, do the kind of intensive educational hands-on requirements that is needed without it affecting sort of our day-to-day interaction with our children, right? Your story earlier about how spending time with your own son planting seeds, right? Just the stress, the anxiety can spill over, and it's hard to know how to, right, wear all these different hats. And I think that we've got to admit that. There are some times when I just need to say, okay, educationally, this is probably the thing that I need to be doing. Education is important. It's not the most important thing. So what I'm going to do is prioritize family relationships, social acceptance, the ways in which we need to be present for our kids and for them to know that we're there with them no matter what, even if they're not, right, getting the math that we're supposed to be working on or doing something like that. And so part of it is we just need to recognize that we are in very uncharacteristic times, that we do the best that we can. We draw on those people around us. We ask for help when needed, which is, again, often hard for some of us to do, even though we publicly talk about how important it is. And then we pray that what we're doing is enough, and we trust in things bigger than us, that hopefully what we're doing really is the best, and that we've gotten it right, and that we're not systematically failing, all while we recognize that our best efforts don't guarantee that we're getting it right.
And maybe then the other side of that question is those of us who strive to be allies in this sort of struggle. And right now, what's amazing is how small the world seems to have become in just 2 weeks. And yet at the same time, how massive and enormous and just the scale of the world continues to show itself. What is it that, I'm doing the best I can with what I've got going on at home, and yet there are plenty of moments where I've probably got a little extra energy that I could give to you or to another friend who's got extra struggles and extra responsibilities they're trying to navigate. What is it that those of us who aren't caretakers in the same way might be able to do in these strange times? Because what might have been the case where you and I could have gone and gotten a drink on a Friday night and just, kind of helped each other think through things, or just taken a minute away, that's not as easy now. And so what is it that the rest of us can be doing to be resources, to be supports, to provide that extra lift, whether it's in relation to advocacy? Is it contacting superintendents? Is it writing letters? Or is it more mundane? Is it just making sure that, we are also part of those social media communities that are passing on encouragement?
At this point, I don't know what legally we can be doing in terms of structural advocacy, right? Right now, we just need to figure out, I think, as a country, what the proper pandemic response is. Admit the seriousness of it, and let's take the kind of collective action that's going to be needed to flatten the curve and to result in fewer deaths. While I'm concerned about sort of the implications of the pandemic for federal education law right now, right, public health might be more important. And so okay, let me take that back. Public health is more important. And so right, I don't know how to do the systemic advocacy that you're asking about right now. But there's a lot we can do personally. I've got a friend back in Idaho who is the full-time caretaker for her disabled spouse. What she needs is community. I actually know some friends that have been doing Zoom-related uh, right, cocktail hour. Sometimes I did it. Part of what I did 2 days ago was spent half an hour just Zooming with two really good friends of mine from graduate school about right trying to be in person as embodied as we can at a social distance, community to each other. Right? So we can all do that kind of stuff. I had a colleague yesterday that texted me, "Hey, I'm going to the grocery. I know that given health-related immunocompromised issues in your house, right, that getting out is even more of a concern than it is for you than for me. What do you need from the store? I will get it to you. I will get it for you if they have it. I will leave it on your front porch. You can disinfect it and bring it in the house," right? And there wasn't anything that I could sort of put on the list, right? But that meant a lot to me that I had colleagues doing that kind of thing. And so, maybe we don't need to be running out and making extra trips these days. But when you do, all the people that have elderly folks in their household, the elderly friends that you have, the disabled friends that you have, people that might have extra social disadvantage in these days, right? Think about them before you go out and reach out to them and just say, I'm going to the seed store to get some stuff for my garden. I know that you've got a garden. Can I pick you up a pack of, tomato seeds or jalapeno seeds or whatever it is, to illustrate to people that you're thinking about them, really does mean a lot. Right? At the beginning of the interview, I said it was unfortunate that it took disability directly impacting one of my children for me to start thinking about it. We should be thinking about the disadvantaged peoples in our communities, whether it's disadvantage for disability-related reasons, or given your shirt for race-related reasons, or for sexism-related reasons, or homophobic-related reasons, class-related reasons. Right? The poor are going to be disproportionately affected even by the present situation, especially given some of the economic implications we're starting to already see. So part of our responsibility as humans, I think, is to think about the disadvantaged and to reach out and try to do what we can, even in these difficult and unprecedented times.
So I think that's a wonderful way to bring this conversation to a close, because you've so articulately reminded us that despite the fact that we are in uncertain and non-normal times, again, what has always been the case remains the case. We need each other. We've got to find ways to care for the widows, the orphans, and the strangers, the marginalized, the dispossessed, the most vulnerable. And in doing this, it's never something that we can do with a clear vision of how to do it, but it's something that we do because it's the right thing to do. And then we do our best, I think, to ask forgiveness for where we make missteps and continue to move forward in ways that hopefully make tomorrow better than today for all of our shared neighbors. So thank you, Kevin, for being part of this conversation. I appreciate the work you're doing publicly. I wish you well with your family, safety and healthy. For all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll have new content coming up very soon. I'm working hard to get a series of philosophers and theologians and academics engaged and thinking with us about these important issues, because ultimately philosophy has always been for the public good. And we've never been having a conversation other than the conversation about how do we make meaning in light of the fact that we are also mortal beings. So thanks for being with us, Kevin. I wish you well.
Yep. Thanks for having me, Aaron.